It's really heartening to see this brief and to hear the discussions at T20, which now talk about a just and inclusive transition. We've, I think, crossed and covered a lot of distance in terms of our conversation on the energy transition bit. I know that, and I recognize that the inclusivity or in equitable transition means different things to different countries. Even within a country, it could mean different things. The priorities could be quite different from one region to the other. Recognizing that well, I think we have experts here who have looked at these diversities, and it would be nice to get a sense of where is there area or scope for collaboration. And for that, I want to turn to John, who's leading the work on the G20 research group and knows about the diversity. So John, over to you on what you think can be key areas where G20 can collaborate.
Thank you very much. 8 key areas that the G20 leaders at Delhi must act on if they're going to seriously try and control the crisis of climate change we now confront. Unprecedented heat in all regions of the world, and it's only going to get worse. All of these 8 areas are addressed in some way in the 52 policy briefs from Task Force 2. But what we've experienced over the past month certainly says that the G20 leaders must act far more ambitiously and urgently than we imagined when we started our work. So what are the 8? 1, end fossil fuel subsidies now and take the $1 trillion you save from doing that and shift it to finance the clean energy transition. Second, again, a promise not yet fulfilled, have G20 governments give $100 billion a year for climate finance to the developing countries of the world and increase that amount every year. Third on the list, end unabated thermal coal by 2030, starting now in the countries that are renewables rich. Brazil, number 1, Canada in second place. Next, triple renewable energy use by 2030 in the global south and much more in the global north. 5, expand the reliable renewables of pumped hydro, wave, tidal, geothermal, and the stored power and grids that lie behind. 6, nurture nature-based solutions by growing trees and preserving peat, as highlighted by our colleagues in Task Force 3. 7, recycle critical minerals. And 8, mobilize the multilateral development banks for climate finance. And we'll come back to those, I'm sure.
Thank you so much. I like how you have an entire wish list there, which makes it actionable. Turning to you, Ulka, you've looked at the equity concerns even within India. So you look at subnational governments, you look at MSMEs. But responding to the general question on what G20 can actually collaborate on, where do you see that there would be convergence in thinking?
Thanks. John spoke about 8 things. I'll speak about just 1. But before I do that, I'm going to make a very sincere, very serious reference to the Barbie movie. And I'm going to talk about an interview that the director of the Barbie movie, Greta Gerwig, gave recently, where she said that when you see French films and you see the credits, and the director is listed over there in the credits, the director is referred to by a French word, which I will not attempt to pronounce, but which literally translates into English as the realizer. And she says that that's an apt description because, the word director sounds like all the stuff exists and you just need to tell it where to go. Whereas with realizer, the stuff doesn't exist. You have to make it up with you and your team. And I'd like to say that the Think Tank 20 initiative, all the think tanks, all the teams in the room present who have worked on the communiques, have really been realizers, creating new ideas, new concepts which doesn't exist before, and taking them to policymakers who will actually test them out. So just wanted to acknowledge that. In terms of what needs to be done, I think that is becoming very clear through reports like the Shell and Terry report. The pace of scaling up action needs to increase. For example, the global share of renewable energy in electricity generation is around 30%. It needs to become 75 to 90% within a decade. But the question is, as we do that, as we scale that up, what might be the inadvertent consequences that arise? Can we do it in a way that also creates better livelihoods for those who didn't have them before? Can we do it in a way that doesn't increase inequity over land or other resources? Similarly, we know the industrial decarbonization that needs to happen. The carbon intensity of steel is around 1,890 kilograms of CO2 per ton of steel. This needs to actually decrease by 30%. But can we do industrial decarbonization in a way that is also good for India's micro, small, and medium enterprises? In, say, the foundry sector that supplies parts to the automotive sector, in a way that is good for women-led MSMEs or women workers in MSMEs. And similarly, in electric vehicles, the share is around 9 to 10%. This needs to become 5 times faster. But can we do it in a way that places as much emphasis on public transport as it does on, say, cars or two-wheelers? So in terms of the, what G20 needs to do together, my vote out of John's wish list of 8 things, my vote would be for finance. That's really the fundamental. That's what will lead to greater trust, greater action, greater ambition. But the example that I want to share with you today is one from India. It's just from last week at the Clean Energy Ministerial, and it's about electric freight. And that's really one of the largest sources of emissions in India, largest growing sources. And under the sort of Niti Aayog's leadership, about 16 manufacturers and logistics supply providers came together and basically committed a demand for almost 8,000 electric freight trucks. And this demand will provide a signal to manufacturers as well. And this is something which is just an example of public procurement. It's there in the communique from this particular task force. And public procurement can be a very powerful instrument to create demand, to provide a policy signal, and to provide long-term certainty. So that's one thing that the G20 countries can do together.
Thank you, Ulka, for that very sort of specific area where there can be collaboration. I do acknowledge that within the transport sector, it's important to think about the inclusivity of it and also thinking about supply chains, which means that you need to think of how these goods are going to move around without the repercussions for the society. So, and you made a very valid point about finance. That leads me to Barbara, who's an influential lady in the space of finance, is also leading the initiative on Innovations Lab at Climate Policy Initiative. So, Barbara, action points on what G20 can collaborate on in finance.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and thank you so much to the organizers for having me here. I feel very privileged, and it's been a fantastic few days already in a beautiful place. So thank you very much to the T20 Secretariat, and thanks for the great kind of leeway into what I wanted to focus on. Going a little bit broader, really focusing on this and necessary levers of finance and policy. And I think, John, you've had a great wish list. If I had known I can have 8, I would have done that. But I'm going to stick on 3 key asks to the G20. And the first one is around clarity for transition finance. I think we all know that we need both to increase and scale quickly up net zero or near zero emission technologies, and at the same time also businesses. But we also know that we need to start progressively reduce emissions from high abating sectors and hard to abate sectors. And in this context, transition finance has attracted a lot of attention. It's continuing to get traction. But I think what we see at the moment is a little bit a wild west of what constitutes transition finance. What does it mean? To whom? What are the different definitions that everyone uses? So where the G20 really could make a difference is by really helping foster a common understanding of what transition finance is. ideally actually helping to develop a common and agreed definition of what transition finance is, and really having that buy-in across developed and developing countries. Because again, for me, what you can't manage, you can't, what you can't measure, you can't manage. So unless there is clarity, it's very hard to make progress and really scale up the finance. So first element, first asked to the G20 is around clarity for transition finance. The second point, and you will not be surprised by that, is money. And we've heard about that both on this panel, but also on previous panels already. We all know that we're falling far short of where we need to be, both on our climate finance goals, but even more so in the SDG goals. And obviously, the broader we go, the further we fall short. So I think in this context, and Amar Bhattacharya is sitting here, had a great discussion at a previous finance panel before lunch. I think a key component that we need to focus on is concessional finance. Concessional finance, catalytic finance, is here to help manage risks, and in doing that really particularly in relation to some of the nascent technologies, some of the areas, the businesses that are still emerging and maturing in the context of energy transitions. So I think here we know from our work at CPI, our global climate finance landscape, that only 16% of current global climate finance is being delivered through concessional finance. So we need to increase the volume of concessional finance, but we also need to improve the way it's being utilized to address some of the risks, and really also through planet finance, but also other things. And we also need to reform the ways in which it's been accessed and what's the eligibility to actually access concessional finance, to make sure that we really mainstream and put the just element at the core of all our climate finance. And the third one, very quickly, I talked about that one as well in previous discussions, is the international finance architecture. I think there is a need to really focus more, not only on how much money is in the system, but also how you use the money once it's in the system, and how can you use it more effectively to mobilize additional capital. I think there is a number of specific areas, and I might talk about them a little later, but I really, for me, kind of having the G20 focus on more on the operating models of the MDBs to help utilize existing resources more effectively to really trigger a just and resilient and low carbon transition, I think would be very important. So I'll leave it here.
Thank you so much. I think the panel has been very, very specific on asks, which is absolutely excellent. Picking up some of the points from what Barbara has spoken about, Albert, you track the Asian markets, and you have your finger on the pulse of the market. What do you think could be potentially done within the region and beyond for G20 to collaborate on especially policy? And do you think that the promise of concessional finance can be delivered through certain mechanisms?
Thank you very much. I agree with all of the comments of my esteemed colleagues here, and I do think ADB, other multilateral development banks, should be focusing on ways of mobilizing more concessional finance. I'm in total agreement with that. I also had a list of 3 asks for the G20, and they're all ways in which G20 countries can continue talking together to help develop market solutions to address the climate challenge. So the first area is carbon pricing. Not only developing emission trading systems within economies, but actually starting to think about international carbon pricing mechanisms. When we released a study that we presented at the mid-year T20 summit, one of the interesting findings was that if each country goes on its own to meet its own net zero commitments, the cost of realizing the goals is much higher than if there was coordination across countries, so that the countries that could reduce carbon most efficiently bore a larger burden in making those reductions. But to do that, of course, they have to be compensated. And one thing that's interesting is that many poor countries, developing countries, are countries which didn't really contribute much to the carbon in the atmosphere, but yet they actually have low cost opportunities to reduce carbon emissions, but because they're poor, lack the fiscal space or financing ability. And if there were some agreements on international burden sharing and pricing mechanism, it would be a natural way where you would see money flowing from rich countries to poor countries to achieve more efficient carbon reductions, which would achieve both equity and efficiency goals at the same time. The second area where I think we can continue talking together is on reporting standards, and disclosure measurement systems, for ESG markets to work, for emissions trading systems to work, for even cross-border adjustment mechanisms to work. We need to figure out how we measure the impact of economic activity on carbon emissions or other environmental outcomes. And we need to think about how countries can develop the capacity to measure, verify, and standardize the way they measure these things. That also supports international coordination in markets as well. And so there's an enormous amount of work that can be done to help build capacity in G20 countries and other economies to support these different green markets. And the last area I wanted to talk about is to really make a plea for free trade in environmental goods. And actually, there are very few free trade agreements which currently have explicit provisions about making sure that environmental goods and services have low tariffs. Even defining what are environmental goods and services is still at a relatively early stage. And obviously, if there are free trade in environmental goods and services, it helps all countries adopt clean technologies more cheaply. And what we've seen recently is some barriers or protectionist elements reflected in local content requirements to industrial policies, export restrictions on essential inputs, mineral inputs, and this all really hurts everybody's ability to achieve a more efficient and more rapid carbon reduction. And so I think everyone needs to agree to lay off the environmental goods and services in terms of these types of measures. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Albert. I like the point about carbon pricing. There was recently a report by the Reserve Bank of India which also talks about and touches upon carbon taxes, which is one pricing mechanism, and they figure that that's one way to address the problem. And I think that is where I think the dialogue needs to open up a little bit. Also on the industrial policy. So today there's a very interesting paper that Danny Rodrigues released. Talks about focusing back on the industrial policy and what it means for different countries, and there needs to be coordination there because otherwise there would be chaos, as I would imagine, even with free trade, as you're mentioning. Having spoken, of what can be done and what needs to be done, there is a structure of conversation that exists, which is the international governance. And John, to you, how do you think there could be reforms within that to sort of move forward on the agenda that we have set for ourselves within the G20, or what we're talking about today?
Very quickly, if you look in the broadest terms at global environmental governance, global energy governance, there's no multilateral organization with the power to compete with the economically focused, northern-controlled IMF and World Bank. And within the energy space, you've got, of course, the relatively powerful OPEC Plus, and from the north, the IEA of the first energy crisis. And on the renewable side, you've got, IRENA and the ISA, but it's not a fair fight by any means. G7 has done a good job, but it's not enough. The BRICS has done even worse. It's only the G20 which has an equal balance of members from the global north and the global south. It has the power to produce the renewables revolution. So there's nowhere else to go, basically, to get the job done as quickly as we must. So the G20, since the start, it's made 181 commitments on energy. By the most generous definition, about 69% of them have been clean energy ones. But compliance by members with them has been only 69%. And that's the same with the climate change commitments they've made. That's below the all-subject average for the G20. So in these two critical subjects, G20 governance at the summit level has failed. Bali did a bit better, 11 energy commitments, and compliance with them 6 months later, it's up to 78%, and that's on both the clean energy ones and on the just transition ones on affordable energy. India, by the way, compliance 100% after 6 months, so another sign of hope. But flash forward to last week, G20 energy ministers meeting. They made 48 commitments, but not one of them was on the 8 areas I identified, including the consensus one, 3 on my list, I think, but we're all agreed on the climate finance one. The G20 climate and energy ministers 3 days ago, I think, did better, 133 commitments, and they did include commitments on 3 of the ones on my list. The $100 billion a year, like, that's so easy to do. On nature-based solutions, growing forests, preserving peat, and maximizing the multilateral development banks for, climate finance. But what's missing? Nothing on fossil fuel subsidies, nothing on unabated coal use, nothing on tripling renewables, nothing on recycling critical minerals, and many other important things mentioned here. So it's really up to the leaders at Delhi to do these big things that are missing. And after all, other ministers work for them, not the other way around.
Thank you so much. And, picking up some of the points on what you think are missing, there's an obvious question around fossil fuel subsidies, but any thoughts that, Ulka, you might have on what it really means or what might be required to reform the governance mechanism which delivers a just and equitable clean energy transition?
Thanks. No, that's a very, very deep question. And I think you've also written about it, Suranjali, so maybe we should keep some time for the chair to also chip in. But definitely there are a couple of issues here. One, and we've recently written about it as well, is that as India transitions away from liquid fossil fuels towards more electrification in transport, there will be implications for the tax revenue that is collected from petrol and diesel. Of course, it has a positive effect, a good effect on our import bill, but it does have a negative effect in terms of the tax revenue that the government gets. I think the current share is almost a quarter of the tax revenue. So issues of fossil fuel, a phase down, of the macroeconomic fiscal implications are certainly extremely important. And I want to talk about one reason why it's especially important. And that reason is also linked to the transition, which is namely that there will be jobs created, but there will also be government revenue required for certain public spending on skilling. Skilling and finally safety nets. Let me talk about the skilling issue. So for example, in a study that we have done where we have a scenario that's consistent with India's net zero 2070 commitment, we see jobs increases in the utility sector, in the construction sector, and in the services sector. Utilities and construction, because obviously we are going to generate much more renewable energy, we're going to produce more green hydrogen. And services because there's a multiplier effect on trade, retail, transportation, repair, all of that. In the manufacturing sector also there is an increase, but if you go deeper subsector-wise, there is a slight difference. So for example, what happens is that there's a relative reduction in the manufacturing of emissions-intensive commodities like glass or basic metals. But there is an increase expected in specialized manufacturing. So that means fabricated metal products, machinery, electrical and electronic equipment. And this is because of the choices that we make. These are the policy assumptions that we make where we are saying that there should be more material use efficiency, more energy efficiency, more shift towards electric mobility and so on. So as a result of this, what happens is this transition is projected to create a shift towards more specialized manufacturing requiring skilling. And one of the things that we're observing is that some of these sectors have anyway not been very friendly towards women. So as these new job opportunities are created, is it that the inequities that currently exist get exacerbated? And there will be a need again for public spending on creating safe transport, childcare facilities, training that women can access without being able to necessarily go far from home. So I think all of these issues are quite interlinked and definitely needs a lot more attention in terms of how they can be solved. One solution, Albert will be happy to know that we have proposed in our paper is to have a compensating carbon tax. But there could be other types of taxes as well. But you do need to compensate somehow. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ulka. You've been able to bring out the tensions as well as the solutions quite clearly. And, the carbon tax divides people so easily. So I'm glad you brought that up. So in a sense, you've talked about the public financing of this transition. And now I want to move on to broader instruments and institutions that might be available. So maybe Barbara, over to you, since you've been innovating in that space. So any ideas?
Absolutely, and I think the discussion here really shows that we need more innovation. We need to think outside of the box because these are challenging issues. These are complex issues. So I think I want to, if I have time, give two kind of examples, but I'm starting with one, which is more kind of an approach and a type of an accelerator that we have been using at CPI and we've been managing at CPI since 2014 to really bring together the ones who understand finance, from the multilaterals to the private sector, institutional investors to philanthropists, into a room and help us identify new ideas, early concept stage ideas that are really able to unlock private capital and use public capital most effectively to really unlock private capital. And in this way, come up with like new financial vehicles that really address some of the barriers and the risks in the market. And the thing I'm talking about is called the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance. Again, we have a specific India chapter, we have a specific Brazil chapter. We have been trying to go more and more to the really geographies where we need more of the action, including also in Africa. But I think just to tell you a little bit what that incubator or accelerator is doing. So we bring together this, the financiers, the ones who understand the market, and we crowdsource ideas from everyone. So we have open calls for ideas every year, where we really ask for ideas from different types of entrepreneurs, project developers, but also financial institutions, domestic financial institutions, to come to share their ideas of how can we really help come up with financial instruments that can unlock private capital for sustainable development at scale to really kind of get the private sector involved. And just in a nutshell, we have, really managed to have some success there since 2014. We have developed more than 60 specific financial instruments and vehicles that have collectively mobilized more than $3.5 billion for concrete projects on the ground in emerging markets, both across mitigation and adaptation. So I think it is an example that really works. You can apply it very well to this space here as well. We have actually evolved. We've started, as you can hear from the name, with a climate finance focused accelerator, but then have evolved that to go broader towards sustainable development, but also bringing in a gender lens, bringing in a lens on just transition, and really trying to use that type of incubator in a way that really can help provide new solutions that hopefully can help bring the right money into these spaces. So I think that's the one part, and I think just the three elements that are really important, that really, I think, are responsible for the success of that accelerator is, first, it's a public-private partnership. So it brings together investors, but also regulators, both from the public and from the private side. ADB is actually a member, so thank you for that. Second, it is thinking outside of the box, like thinking about coming up with innovative, transformative ideas and giving entrepreneurs a chance to really help us kind of show these ideas and then get technical assistance from our side to develop these ideas. And then the third one, and I come back to the money side, is actually catalytic capital or concessional capital. Again, many of our members are actually investing themselves in these instruments. So I think these three elements just have helped to come up with a very powerful instrument that we are continuing to use. Very quickly, just I know I'm talking far too much, but I'm very passionate about that one, and I think we need to kind of spread the word of what works. But one other idea that my team here in India actually has been developing is how can we approach the issue of high cost of capital in emerging economies, which again we have heard on the previous panel is one of the key impediments to larger investments in emerging economies and developing countries. So we have, in conjunction with the International Solar Alliance, ISA, done a market readiness assessment of more than 40 ISA countries and that have very high solar output and therefore a very high investment potential. But what we wanted to understand is what are the specific risks that are actually related to investment into solar energy, and what's the implications of those risks on the commercial viability of those projects. And just in a nutshell, what we found is actually that while most of the electricity growth demand is obviously being driven by emerging and developing countries, at the moment most of the renewable energy and transition investments take place in advanced economies and in China. And so the reason behind that is that there are still some risks that are just not addressed effectively, including credit risk, political risk of these countries, and foreign exchange risk. So we think that we need a new kind of a global risk mitigation facility, or we call it our global credit guarantee facility, that really can help de-risk this cross-border capital flows and really reduce the cost of capital in this way, by really focusing mostly on the credit risk, because we do feel that bundling too many risks in one institution or in one fund can sometimes make it very difficult to address those risks effectively. So we think focusing on this credit risk for lenders can really help, while other risks such as political risk or foreign exchange risk can be covered by institutions that already have a track record, such as MIGA or the TCX fund for foreign exchange. So just to say, I think there's a lot of ideas, and I think the G20 again could put these ideas, these concrete ideas, on the table and really make sure that then hopefully there is willingness from the MDBs to maybe jointly capitalize such a facility, and therefore again using the MDB group of the G20 to really bring the details of that facility and get it off the ground very quickly. I'm stopping here.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I think that I really like your idea about the global risk mitigation facility. Maybe this is a conversation that can continue until COP and something maybe announced there. Moving to you, Albert, your thoughts on instruments and institutions that can deliver the kind of finance as well as clean and just energy transition.
Thank you. So I actually share many of the views that Barbara just expressed about what needs to be done in terms of climate finance. I think at Asian Development Bank, as a multilateral bank, I think we recognize that we potentially can play a real pivotal role because we bring our own public finance, and we have a private finance part of our operations. We have a kind of a convening power, a AAA rating, a trust among both governments and private and public sector participants. And we can try to leverage all of these advantages to try to really further the climate finance agenda. So, I mean, two aspects of that is, I agree we need to really mobilize more concessional finance, but also we need to think about bringing concessional finance and private sector finance together, because the amount of investment, as you know, that's needed is much more than the total loan kind of portfolios available from the multilateral bank. So it has to leverage the private sector. We've been, at ADB, been trying to be very innovative in how we think about financing mechanisms, and we've been, I think, working with other organizations to get ideas. So two of the ones that we've been kind of championing in the last couple of years is the energy transition mechanism, which raises money from a kind of blended sources to create financial incentives for coal-fired power plants to retire early, and we're working in Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam on this. It's still relatively early stages. And a second is one that we announced at our annual meetings in May this year, which is called IFCAP, the Innovative Financing Facility for Climate in Asia Pacific, which uses guarantees committed by donor governments, developed country governments, to, by guaranteeing parts of the ADB portfolio, allows us to leverage that to lend much more. So for every dollar of guarantee, we can leverage $5 of lending. With an initial commitment of something like $3 billion, we could lend $15 billion more dollars for climate change action. And I think the World Bank is also now talking about doing something similar to that. And moreover, we're trying to, in an organizational reform this year, we're trying to have our public sector operations work much more closely in sync with our private sector operations, to work together, especially to de-risk, as you said, some of the key risks facing renewable energy projects. So there was the largest wind farm in Uzbekistan we helped fund. We used a public sector sovereign loan to de-risk the grid access risk that the energy supplier was perceiving as being a real deal breaker for them. And with the sovereign loan guaranteeing that risk, taking that off the table, then most of the financing came from a large private sector loan, and the company was willing to go forward with the project. So that's an example. I think there's many types of risks and many types of ways to blend finance to try to address some of the risks that are barriers to green investment projects, especially in countries where institutions are a little bit less developed, so investors perceive many different types of risk that need to be understood clearly and then addressed. So maybe I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Maybe we'll move to the billions, to the trillions. Wishing all the best people like Barbara who are taking initiatives, and Albert are also leading within their organization. Promit, so we open it up for questions, and if anyone.
Hi, I'm Viola D'Souza from Manipal Academy of Higher Education. My question is to John. How to ensure energy security in fragile and conflict-affected states?
That's a tough one, but let's start with one that is central to the critical minerals story, the Democratic Republic of Congo and all its neighbors in Africa that are torn apart by conflict recurrently. The way we in the global north and increasingly in the rest of the G20 and beyond are financing and their critical mineral supply, because we need them up north. It's not going to governments, it's going to all sorts of non-state actors, and actually fueling the war, which is why I think it's important to highlight the one I did from our task force, recycle critical minerals. Because if we simply take all of the batteries in all of the electrical vehicles that we're building or importing, they are mini cobalt and lithium mines that we will own ourselves in exactly the right place. So all of the problems that we heard yesterday with critical minerals, all the supply chains and political risk, they all disappear. So that's one answer to the question. And then, of course, we can think of all of the conflict that has arisen from those who rely on the fossil fuels and all that brings. But let's look on the bright side. Just recently, a new president of Nigeria took over. And within days of being inaugurated, he completely eliminated all the fossil fuel subsidies. If Nigeria can do it, and I think our friend from Shell Oil will know the Nigerian story and its dependence traditionally on oil and fossil fuel subsidies for political stability, it's said, then I think every G20 member can do it too.
Yeah, thanks very much. My name is Rose Ngugi. I come from Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis in Kenya. My question is directed to Albert and Barbara. There are two short questions. The first question, I heard you, Albert, talk about bringing the aspect of efficient emissions and therefore looking at free trade for goods and services that are environmentally friendly. And I'm asking myself if we can give free trade and no tariff to green goods and services, can we at the same time also say that we can establish a tariff for countries that are not efficient in emissions so that they can have a self-discipline? The second question is related to concessional funding. I think the issue that Barbara is bringing out is about how to mobilize a lot of concessional funding, and mainly also focusing on MDPs. And I'm thinking about an institution like IMF, where recently we've seen SDRs being put in the Resilience Sustainability Trust Fund. But I think that the countries that actually need this funding more are countries, the low-income countries, countries in Africa and the like. But a key element that makes them unable to access adequately is the access limits that we have in these institutions. So what do you think is the low-hanging fruit for these countries actually to access adequately these concessional fundings? Thank you.
So thank you. Those are both very good questions. On the question about can we impose tariffs on countries that are not efficient in their emissions, I think we have the proposal from Europe, right? The cross-border adjustment mechanism, which is designed to tax embedded carbon emissions in imports in countries that don't impose any type of a carbon price or carbon tax. And it looks like that is going to go forward. There are a lot of implementation issues around that. There's a lot of concern that it will actually hurt the export and growth potential of developing countries who are exporting to these markets, although we did an analysis on how it will affect countries in Asia, and it seems somewhat limited just because the categories of goods that CBAM will initially begin in are not actually ones that Asia is exporting a lot to. Actually, Africa exports more of these goods to Europe than Asia does, so might suffer more in the penalties. But the other difficulty there is how do we really account for differences even among firms in terms of the carbon content of their exports, because there's a lot of information requirements that measuring and imposing taxes on embedded carbon emissions requires. You have to measure the carbon emissions embedded in goods coming from different countries in different sectors. And I think for countries that have fairly weak capacity to do that, they're just going to be taxed at the highest rate with the most conservative assumptions. And I think that will generate quite a lot of dissatisfaction. The other aspects about CBAM that we've reflected on is that it seems odd that, if Europe has a price mechanism and basically they're collecting revenues from poor countries and then using those revenues to then, I think, go ahead and support their own producing companies in these protected sectors. If you really wanted to think about the right direction of financial flows, it should be that at least these funds could be returned maybe back to the developing countries to support progress in making their exports less emissions intensive. Or another thought that I had was that the exporting countries, if they really thought they were going to be subject to such taxes, they should just impose their own export tax on their producers for the same amount, and that way they keep the revenue and they don't have to give it to the European countries. But all of these are implementations which are some need to be worked out going forward.
I think great points, Albert, very aligned. I think great second question on concessional finance. I think there's two parts of that, the answer to that question. One, and again, Amma Bhattacharya is sitting here, you need to think about new sources, also innovative sources for concessional finance. Obviously, there is always this development assistance where we can think about using more of that to come up with the right concessional finance, or trying to, again, kind of get more sources from some of the public financial institutions. But I think the second part, which is really important to me, is we need to be more careful on how we allocate how you can access that concessional finance. So coming up with better ways to really make sure we are not providing concessional finance for very advanced technologies that maybe are already kind of ripe for private investors, but that we provide an allocation to either countries that are more vulnerable, which have more needs, and at the same time also thinking about, for specific projects, other ways for eligibility for concessional finance. Can we use auctions to say, okay, the ones who actually have a very innovative project with very high kind of standards for like measuring the impact on climate and vulnerability, can those actually be the ones who get allocated concessional finance? So I think there's lots of ideas that are there, but I think it's a very important point, so thanks for making the question.
So one small point. You mentioned the IMF Resilience Fund. This is a new facility that the IMF has created. It's very popular. They're getting lots of requests from countries. I think it's still a welcome addition, even though it's somewhat cumbersome sometimes for countries to go through the protocols and procedures to access this finance. So, but I think it reflects a flexibility from the IMF to try to address the climate issues and not just be coming in when there's a financial crisis.
Thank you so much. And I think we got our wish list of what G20 can do going forward. Thank you so much to the lovely panelists and to the audience for listening. Thank you.